1. The liberty which Christ hath purchased for believers under the gospel consists in their freedom from the guilt of sin, the condemning wrath of God, the curse of the moral law, and in their being delivered from this present evil world, bondage to Satan, and dominion of sin, from the evils of afflictions, the sting of death, the victory of the grave, and everlasting damnation, as also in their free access to God, and their yielding obedience unto Him, not out of slavish fear, but a childlike love and a willing mind, all of which were common also to believers under the law, but not under But under the New Testament, the liberty of Christians is further enlarged in their freedom from the yoke of the ceremonial law to which the Jewish Church was subjected, and in greater boldness of access to the throne of grace, and in fuller communications of the free Spirit of God than believers under the law did ordinarily partake of. 2. God alone is the Lord of the conscience, and hath left it free from the doctrines and commandments of men, which are in anything contrary to His word, or beside it, in matters of faith or worship, so that we believe this. So that to believe such doctrines or to obey such commandments out of conscience is to betray true liberty of conscience, and the requiring of an implicit faith and an absolute and blind obedience is to destroy liberty of conscience and reason also. 3. They who, upon pretence of Christian liberty, do practice any sin or cherish any lust, do thereby destroy the end of Christian liberty, which is that, being delivered out of the hands of our enemies, we might serve the Lord without fear, in holiness and righteousness before Him, all the days of our life. 4. And because the powers which God hath ordained and the liberty which Christ hath purchased are not intended by God to destroy, but mutually to uphold and preserve one another, they who, upon pretence of Christian liberty shall oppose any lawful power or the lawful exercise of it, whether it be civil or ecclesiastical, resist the ordinance of God, and for their publishing of such opinions or maintaining of such practices as are contrary to the light of nature or to the known principles of Christianity, whether concerning faith, worship, or conversation, or the power of godliness, or such erroneous opinions or practices as either in their own nature or in the manner of publishing or maintaining them are destructive to the external peace and order which Christ hath established in the Church, they may lawfully be called to account and proceeded against by the censures of the Church. End quote. The importance of this concept in our history cannot be overstated. Too often we credit the modern liberal state, an enemy of Christian liberty and of all liberty of conscience, with our contemporary liberty of conscience. However, as historian L. John Van Til has shown, this was a Puritan idea derived from Scripture and with difficulty imposed on the civil order by law. The modern Church and State are hostile to Christian liberty and are working to destroy it. Clarke has made this clear with respect to the Church. Quote, some years ago, a young man presented himself to a presbytery for ordination. As he was known to believe that the boards and agencies of that church were infiltrated with modernism, he was asked whether he would support the boards and agencies. He replied that he would support them insofar as they are true to the Bible. He replied that he would support them insofar as they were true to... Can't make it up. insofar as they were true to the Bible. This answer did not please Presbytery, and he was asked if he would support the boards regardless of what they did. When the young man declined to make any such blind promise, the Presbytery refused to ordain him. One of his friends remarked that the difference between modernism and Christianity might be stated thus: in modernism, you believe as you please but do what the officials tell you. In true Presbyterianism, you do as you please so long as you believe what the confession says. End quote. The issue is... Hello, Madonna. The issue in this matter was ultimate authority. Did it reside in God and His Word, or in the Church? If men deny the ultimate, absolute and infallible authority of God, then that authority accrues to some human agency, institution, office or group of men. In the case cited by Clarke, the infallibility of Scripture had been specifically denied and the total authority of the Church affirmed. As Clarke pointed out, quote, one of Christ's most serious complaints about the Pharisees was that they substituted the commandments of men for the teachings of God. Matthew 15:9. End quote. This was not a peculiarity limited to the Pharisees. In every age, whenever and wherever men deny God, they will then ascribe all authority to man, or to some aspect of man's life, or to an institution established by men. The alternative to God's authority is never, quote, no authority, end quote, but always some other authority of either anarchistic man or organized man. The ultimate and absolute authority of God is simply transferred to another agency. Clarke commented further, quote, the 20th century church in America seems to have fallen into a curious self-contradiction. The lust for power and control over men and organizations has produced an almost papal claim to authority on the part of bureaucratic ecclesiastical officials. When the majority speaks and the officials manipulate the majority, it is the voice of God. Yet, with all this unscriptural claim to authority, the officials and their obedient servants are horrified at the thought of censuring or excommunicating a minister who denies the virgin birth or the resurrection. No doubt such a thought strikes too close to home. End quote. With all due respect to Clarke, no, quote, self-contradiction, end quote, is involved by a necessary and strict logic. Having denied the authority of God and His Word, such churchmen must assert some other kind of authority, and in their case, it is the authority of the Church as controlled by them. Our Lord declared, quote, no man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Matthew 6:24, compare Luke 16:13. Apostate churchmen are serving their new master, a church created in their own image. If God is our ultimate and absolute authority, then God is also the source of our liberties, liberty of conscience, civil liberty, religious liberty, and all things else. We are free only insofar as God gives us freedom, and we are bound insofar as God binds us to Himself. Where the state is the ultimate authority, there the state sets the boundaries of our freedom and retains the right to limit, to extend or to abolish them. Man's conscience can only be bound then by the state, and the state can compel men's conscience as man's ultimate authority. If the Church claims this power over men, then man's freedom and conscience are subject to the Church and the will of the Church. And the will of the Church. Then man's freedom and conscience are subject to the Church and the will of the Church. Apart from the Old Testament tradition, the ancient world knew no freedom of conscience apart from the state and anarchistic man. If a man denied the authority of the state to compel his conscience or to restrict his actions and protested, which rarely occurred, he did it in terms of anarchism. Thus Socrates opposed to the authority of the state the voice of his own daemon or private revelation. The Cynics took a position of radical anarchism as their means of countering statist absolutism. It was thus the absolutism of the individual as against the absolutism of the state. In Israel, however, in the name of God, men could challenge kings and priests as Nathan did when he confronted King David with his sin, declaring, "Thou art the man." 2 Samuel 12:7. The whole history of Old Testament prophecy is a history of such a continuing challenge in the name of the Lord. Neither priests nor kings were allowed, Neither priests nor kings were allowed to absolutize themselves and set their authority against the word of the Lord. Conflict between Christians and Rome was thus inevitable. Rome allowed no independent conscience or religious liberty. For Rome, as for Greece, man was a creature of the state. Rome was ready to be tolerant and to license diverse religions, provided that at all times the religious priority of the genius of Rome was granted. This the Christians could not accept. Ultimate authority rests with God, not the state. In pleading their cause, the Christians cited the fact that they were better citizens than their non-Christian neighbours, more honest and loyal, and obedient in all other matters. This plea Rome rejected. The ultimate authority of the triune God could not be granted. Christ must submit to Caesar. The fall of Rome did not end the battle. It entered a second phase with Constantine the Great. The existence of the Church as an independent realm under Christ was more or less granted, but a long conflict between Church and state began, each claiming best to express Christ's ultimate authority and to represent God on earth. The third phase of the battle came with the Puritans. William Perkins and Elizabethan. William Perkins, he likes jerkins and gherkins. William Perkins, an Elizabethan Puritan theologian, developed, quote, a theology of conscience, end quote. He challenged the primacy of the state. The roots of his position were in Calvin, and the essence of it was sphere laws. Each area of life is a law sphere under God. Church, state, family, school, vocation, mathematics, physics, etc. are independent and interdependent law spheres, alike under God rather than under the control of any one of them. The essence of this position is that God's ultimate and absolute authority limits all authorities, institutions and spheres. Okay, I missed the word out. Kind of important word. Ultimate and absolute authority limits all human authorities, institutions and spheres. This means also that man himself is limited. Man cannot claim absolute powers or liberties because man, no less than church, state, and all things else, is under the absolute government of God. Both collectivism and anarchism are thus untenable from a Christian perspective. In the fourth phase of the battle, as Christian faith waned, the state began to claim increasing power over every area and sphere of life. Totalitarianism has arisen as faith has declined. Anarchism has also flourished, the absolute individual claiming independence from God and other men alike. These trends cannot be countered by stressing the primacy of political action, but by declaring the primacy of God and faith in Him. The issue at stake is authority. Quote, the question of authority is crucial in any view of conscience. In fact, the claim of conscience is no better than the authority called upon. End quote. If our authority is man or the state, our only possible view of conscience or liberty is strictly governed by the limitations of our principle of ultimacy. We have only as much freedom of conscience and liberty as the state chooses by its legislation to grant us, and no more. If our authority is ourselves, anarchistic man, then we have no more authority, power, and liberty than an individual man is able to assert in a world of competing men. Our conscience is then a law unto itself. But our power is the extent of our liberty, so that we are limited indeed. The implications of the Christian gospel were startling to the Greco-Roman world. Both to new converts and to its enemies, Christianity seemed to be lawless. Its enemies regarded it as atheistic because of its denial of existing authorities. As a result, the New Testament is full of commandments to submit to duly constituted authorities. Thus, 1 Peter 2:13-19 declares, quote, "Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors, as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. Honour all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honour the king. Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward. For this is thankworthy, if a man for conscience toward God endure grief, suffering wrongfully." End quote. We fail to appreciate the meaning of this statement if we do not see that it was necessary for St. Peter and others to so command the Christians. By declaring the prior authority of God and the kingship of Messiah Jesus, the apostles had opposed to the claims of ultimate authority by Caesar the ultimate authority of Christ. They had to be warned against a misuse of their Christian liberty. Galatians 5:13. It was necessary also to teach the Christians why authorities should be obeyed. The Corinthians had been ready to see even moral law dissolved by God's higher authority. The authorities, they were told, are ordained of God and are under His judgment. The role of civil officers is to be a ministry of justice and a terror to evildoers. Romans 13:1-8. Honour should therefore be rendered to all authorities as a duty to God. The office, not the man, is honoured. The command, therefore, is to, quote, "submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake," end quote. St. Peter thus requires obedience to the king as, quote-unquote, supreme in his realm, the state. In verse 17, the verb timao, honour, is applied equally to, quote, the brotherhood, end quote, that is, fellow Christians, and to the king. The king, thus, while having a supreme authority under God in his realm, is no more highly to be honoured apart from that realm than are all our fellow believers. We are, in verse 16, described as, quote, free, end quote, or freemen, who are called to use our freedom, not as a covering for maliciousness, but as God's bondsmen. But as God's bondmen, covering for maliciousness, but as God's bondmen, working to further God's kingdom. We are to honour all men, give to all men their due authority and dignity under God. Verse 17. Our obedience is, quote, to every ordinance of man, end quote, verse 13, or literally, quote, to every human creation, end quote. The word ktesis, or, quote, creation, end quote, normally refers to every creative act of God. Only once does it have a reference to human actions in 1 Peter 2:13. Church, state, vocations, families, etc. are human creations. They represent the dominion of man as expressed through various channels. They are human creations which are still the will and purpose of God in His word and eternal decree. These ordinances or creations thus have a special status. As Mason noted, St. Peter, quote, does not say that we are to submit to every law that men may pass, end quote. Laws can be the fiat creation of men and often are. We are not to We are not to disobey all such laws, but all which would compel us to deny God or to sin. We thus submit to the ordinances of our. We thus submit. We thus submit to the ordinances or orders, but not to all laws. The biblical method of social renewal is not either civil disobedience or revolution, but regeneration. It is, quote, the will of God, end quote, that, quote, with well-doing, end quote, we make our reforms and also muzzle or gag the critics who accuse us of being in principle rebellious because we deny the ultimacy of man, the state, or any other human agency. Mason noted with respect to verse 16 and its declaration of Christian freedom and restraint, quote, this points at once to what was the gist of the accusation. The Christian took up a position of complete independence within and professed himself, in a certain sense, to be above the laws by virtue of being a member of Christ's kingdom. This position of independence the heathen state resented and looked upon the Christian church as a dangerous organization. Here, therefore, St. Peter both insists upon and defines that independent position. Quote, this, the apostle adds, end quote, says Leighton, quote, lest any should be so far mistaken that lest any should so far mistake the nature of their Christian liberty as to dream of an exemption from obedience either to God or to man for his sake and according to his appointments. Their freedom he grants, but would have them understand aright what it is. End quote. Freedom is not to be used as a, quote, cloak of maliciousness, end quote, or a curtain for vice, but as servants or slaves of God. The mark of grace, quote, for this is thankworthy, literally, for this is grace, end quote, is to be ready to endure wrong rather than create the greater wrong of disobeying God. Where God requires obedience, we must submit for the sake of conscience. Christian liberty, thus, is grounded in the supreme authority of God over every area of life and in our necessary obedience to God. Our necessary obedience to God means our necessary liberty under God from rival claims of ultimacy and our necessary disobedience where we must obey God rather than men. Okay, I didn't expect to be over so soon. Yeah. I'm sorry if I'm talking too fast, but yeah, I'm sorry. Anyway, thanks for joining me. Wow. We're in Leuve, chapter Leuve, almost Leuve. So I hope to see you soon.